USSR, November 1971. The Western Urals. An old military UAZ rolled along a snow-covered highway, sending up a fountain of ice chips from under the wheels. Lieutenant Sergei, wrapped in the sheepskin collar of his greatcoat, stared intently into the void outside the window. Nature seemed dead here. The dark fir trees, broken by the wind, stood like the mutilated bones of an ancient monster. There were no lights, no villages, just a road stretching into infinity. "We'll be there soon, Comrade Lieutenant," the driver said without taking his eyes off the road. His voice sounded strange, as if muffled by the falling snow. Sergei did not answer. His mind was focused on the task. He was assigned to oversee a new classified KGB project. The study of mysterious atmospheric phenomena, flashes of light that occur in places with increased geomagnetic activity. These phenomena resembled the northern lights, but were unpredictable. In such areas, equipment broke down, communications were disrupted, and sometimes eyewitnesses heard what sounded like voices. Information about the phenomenon came from geologists working in the Polar Urals region. They described bright multicolored flashes, strange equipment failures, and even hallucinations. Several expeditions disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only rumors. Then the KGB intervened. The UAZ turned onto a narrow, almost snow-covered road and a few minutes later pulled up to a massive concrete fence wrapped with live barbed wire. Vetrov felt as if he had been slightly electrocuted. The air here was strangely heavy, electrified. Beyond the gate was the base, gray concrete barracks, hangars, and radio towers. Colonel Antonov, a tall, thin man with stern, deep, set eyes, came out to meet him. "Come along, Comrade Lieutenant Ugd," he said shortly, without bothering with formalities. Vetrov was led into an underground bunker dimly lit by fluorescent lights. In the center of the room was a large screen on which images of the night sky were broadcast in real time, shimmering with strange, almost surreal colors. "This?" Sergei asked, nodding at the image. "Yes. The phenomenon we call rainbow." The picture on the screen has changed. Now there were satellite images. On one of them, Sergei noticed people in protective suits standing on the edge of a brightly shining zone. The next frame made him wince. Something was growing out of the center of the flash. A blurry, black silhouette whose shape defied logic. "What is it?" Sergei's voice trembled treacherously. "We don't know," Antonov replied shortly. That evening, Vetrov's group was sent to a training ground located 20 kilometers from the base. There was a snowstorm, and the flakes of snow creaked under their feet as they got out of the truck. Everything seemed strangely muffled, as if the world was wrapped in thick cotton wool. When they reached the zone, Sergei immediately noticed that the snow here had an unnatural shade, as if it were covered with black grains. No one dared to speak, but the tension in the air was palpable. Then there was a sound. It wasn't the wind or the cracking of the ice. It was a voice. Female. Muffled, like it was coming through an old radio. "Help me. I'm here." One of the soldiers instantly raised his machine gun. His eyes were wide with fear. "Who's there?" "Stop it," he shouted, stepping forward. Suddenly, a bright, blinding glow flashed in front of them. Everyone froze for a moment, trying to see what was behind the curtain of light. And then they saw. There was something that looked like a human figure lying in the snow. As he approached, Vetrov realized that it was a man in a burnt protective suit. The face under the broken glass of the mask was distorted in a silent scream. And then the body moved. Vetrov froze, gripping the cold handle of the Makarov. The other fighters also froze, as if time had suddenly lost its course. There was a man lying in the snow in front of them, or what had once been a man. The protective suit was burned, the glass of the mask was broken, revealing a face distorted in a silent scream. Vetrov could not take his eyes off his eyes, which were completely white, without irises or pupils. They were wide open, like those of a drowned man who had been lying underwater for a long time. And then the body moved. A barely noticeable movement. The fingers trembled in the glove, as if tasting the snow. Then an arm twitched, then a leg. It seemed that the man was trying to get up, but something was holding him back, preventing him from getting up. "My God, is he alive?" One of the fighters whispered, but then stopped, as if afraid of his own voice. "Hush," Antonov snapped. Vetrov slowly, almost against his will, took a step forward. The thought was pounding in my head. "Who are you? How did you end up here? Can you hear me?" His own voice sounded muffled, as if the air was muffling the sound. The man in the snow shuddered. A strangled, agonized wheeze escaped from his mouth. Vetrov clearly saw his chest rise with an effort, then fall. And then he spoke. The voice was strange, cracked, like a broken speaker. See me? These 3 words pierced Vetrov through and through. The fighter on the right cursed and crossed himself. The other one stepped back, but the snow under his feet suddenly cracked, as if there was not earth under him, but thin ice. Helicopter, urgently. Antonov threw into the radio, but in response there was only a quiet hiss of static. And then something happened. The man in the snow arched sharply, as if from an electric shock. An inhuman, long, drawn sound escaped from his throat, like the howl of the wind passing through broken glass. Then he raised his head. And he looked at them. His face suddenly distorted, blurring like an image on an old TV screen. His eyes turned into black holes. The silence exploded with screams. One of the soldiers fired, but the bullet just went through, leaving not a drop of blood. At the same moment, the light dimmed, plunging the polygon into total darkness. There was silence for a second. And then? Voices. Hundreds of voices speaking at the same time. They came from everywhere, from the air, from the ground, from the darkness itself. Help me, they are coming. They will take us away. And then the footsteps. In the darkness, something was coming towards them. Vetrov wanted to scream, but his throat was constricted by a spasm of horror. He couldn't move. Someone invisible seemed to be holding him, clutching his spine with icy fingers. The footsteps were getting closer. And suddenly, a flash. The spotlight hit my eyes. The darkness receded. The voices died away. The man in the burnt suit disappeared. It was as if he had never been there. Vetrov gasped for air. My hands were shaking. The soldiers stood, dumbfounded, looking around, unable to understand what had just happened. Antonov slowly holstered his pistol. We're going back to base, he said softly. Right now. But Vetrov knew that this was only the beginning. Moscow, December 1971. The underground archive of the KGB. The old, echoing corridor stretched away into the darkness. Bare concrete walls, sparse ceiling lights, and a generator that hummed softly. Lieutenant Sergei Vetrov walked after Colonel Antonov, feeling a dull tension inside. They were in the very heart of the Moscow office of the KGB in an archive that only a few had access to. After the events at the Raduga training ground, Vetrov and the others were urgently evacuated. The official version is a military exercise, an accident. The real one is unknown even to them. No one could explain what happened that night. No one understood what they were seeing. Antonov stopped in front of a massive steel door and inserted the key into the lock. There was a dull click, and the door slid heavily into the wall. Come in, Comrade Vetrov, the colonel said. Vetrov entered. The room he found himself in resembled an operating theater. Rows of shelves with folders, old radio installations, tape recorders. In the far corner stood a man in civilian clothes, gray-haired, with deep-set eyes full of fatigue. This is Major Sidorov, Antonov introduced him. The only one who has seen it before. Sidorov nodded and sat down at his desk, laying out several yellowed folders in front of him. The Rainbow Project is nothing new, Lieutenant, he said in a low, even voice. The first recorded cases date back to the 40s. At first, the phenomena were rare and scattered, but with each passing decade, they intensified. He opened the first folder. 1946 Kuril Islands. The Soviet destroyer Loud entered the zone of an unusual glow in the atmosphere. An hour later, the connection was lost. When the ship was discovered, it was drifting without signs of life. Not a single crew member was found. There was a recording going on in the radio room. Sidorov turned on the tape recorder. Static hissed in the speaker, and then a voice was heard. They're here, they're watching, they're already inside. Then there was a high-pitched screeching sound, similar to the sound of tearing metal. The recording stopped. Vetrov swallowed. And this? He pointed to the second folder. 1958, Novaya Zemlya. Soviet test pilot Captain Grushin flew up to a similar phenomenon. The plane disappeared from radar, but a day later the captain was found on the other side of the archipelago. Alive. Completely unharmed. But, what? He didn't recognize himself in the mirror. He said his face was someone else's. 3 days later, he committed suicide. Vetrov clenched his fists. What the hell is this? Sidorov closed the folder and looked straight into his eyes. Do you really want to know? There was a long silence. Antonov sighed and stood up. Lieutenant, you have 2 options. Either you forget what you saw, or you go to the end. Vetrov ran his tongue over his parched lips. I'm going to the end. Antonov nodded. Then listen carefully. Tomorrow you will fly to the zone of a new phenomenon. Now it's not just studying anomalies. It's a hunt. Vetrov turned cold. Hunting? For whom? Antonov slowly took out a black and white photograph from his pocket. It showed a man in a military uniform. The face is blurred, as if covered with a veil. At him, said the colonel. But who is he? Sidorov answered instead of Antonov. This is Major Alexei Gromov, the Soviet pilot. What about him? Sidorov looked at Vetrov as if he already knew how he would react. He disappeared in 1985. Silence hung in the room, heavy as lead. Excuse me. Vetrov frowned. Did you say in 1985? Yes. But it's 1971. Exactly. Vetrov felt a chill run down his spine. That's impossible. Sidorov closed his eyes. That's the point, Lieutenant. This whole damn thing? It doesn't just violate the laws of physics. She is timeless. It seemed to Vetrov that the walls of the bunker began to shrink around him. And now what? Antonov spoke clearly and coldly again. Now, Comrade Vetrov, you're going after him. USSR, December 1971, the KGB airbase. The night sky was clear, frosty and dotted with cold stars. A huge black Mi-6 helicopter stood on a snow-covered concrete field, flickering taillights cast ghostly reflections on its hull. The engines roared, drowning out all other sounds. Sergei Vetrov tightened the parachute straps and checked the radio. There were 3 more men standing behind him, members of the Rubin Special Group, who had been sent with him to the zone of the new phenomenon. Winds. Antonov's voice cut through the roar of the propellers. The colonel stepped closer, leaning towards him. Do you know the task? Vetrov nodded. We are flying to the area above the Polar Urals. The task is to establish contact with the object, record the manifestations of the phenomenon and return. And find Gromov, Antonov added. Yes, Vetrov swallowed, to find Gromov. Antonov nodded curtly. If something goes wrong, you know what to do. The phrase hung in the air. Vetrov understood her meaning. If Gromov proves to be dangerous, he must be destroyed. Before he could answer, the connection in his headphones went dead. Take off in 30 seconds. Vetrov stepped up to the helicopter and climbed inside. The takeoff was fast and hard. The helicopter rocked as it rose above the base and went off into the blackness of the northern night. After about 20 minutes, the connection hissed again. The object is fixed. The coordinates flashed on the front screen. Vetrov looked closer. Right in front of them, 200 kilometers from the base, was the epicenter of a new phenomenon. Get ready, we will enter the zone in 5 minutes. The soldiers checked their weapons. Vetrov tried to remain calm, but the tension inside was becoming unbearable. The zone started suddenly. The helicopter jerked sharply to the side, as if an invisible hand was pulling it down. All the devices blinked, the connection was lost. What the hell? The pilot shouted. Vetrov looked out the porthole. And I saw a sky that shouldn't have been there. It shimmered with abnormal colors, as if lightning was playing inside the spilled oil. The orange, green and purple flashes moved as if they had a life of their own. But the worst part was what was below. There was a figure standing on the snow-white desert. Human. Right in the middle of a bare ice plateau, without protection, without equipment. And he was looking up. Is that Gromov? One of the fighters shouted. Let's go down, Vetrov ordered. The helicopter went down heavily, fighting the wind. When it was about 10 meters from the ground, the figure began to move. No. Don't move. She disappeared. Where is he? The fighters began to look around. Vetrov managed to notice a shadow that flashed by the edge of the view. On the right. But it was too late. The helicopter exploded. More precisely, he was torn apart. No sound, no flame. Vetrov felt as if something invisible had snatched him out. The air was gone, the world was gone. He was falling into the void. When he woke up, there was nothing around. The space he was in was indescribable. It seemed like he was hanging in absolute darkness, but he could see everything. Vetrov tried to move, and realized that he couldn't feel his body. Winds! The sound came from somewhere inside. He turned around. More precisely, what was left of him turned around. There was a man standing in front of him. His face was blurry, as if someone had smeared the photo with a wet brush. But Vetrov knew who it was. Gromov. The figure leaned closer. You shouldn't have come here, she said, and Vetrov realized that it was no longer Gromov. Vetrov couldn't breathe. More precisely, he didn't know if he was breathing at all. His body seemed to have disappeared, but his mind remained clear. He was there, he felt it, but he didn't know where. The space around him had no boundaries. Blackness? No, the lack of color. The darkness? No, the lack of light. And Gromov was standing right in front of him. But it wasn't a man. The contours of his body trembled like an image projected through a cloudy glass. Face. Vetrov tried to concentrate, to catch the features, but they were changing. Her eyelids twitched, and her skin seemed to tremble under an invisible wave. You shouldn't have come here, he said again. It was his voice, but there was something subtly wrong with it. Thunderbolts? Vetrov managed to say. Gromov, or whatever it was that was wearing his appearance, bowed his head slightly. Was him. Vetrov clenched his fists, although he wasn't even sure if he had hands right now. What happened to you? Where are we? Gromov did not respond immediately. He raised his head, and his eyes. Lord, they weren't human eyes. Black, shiny, without pupils, without whites. Smooth as glass. They reflected the darkness. And Vetrov realized that he was looking into something infinite. This is not the place, Gromov said slowly. This is not the time. Vetrov felt the pressure. It was as if something was pressing on his consciousness, breaking the boundaries of reality. Gromov exhaled, and the space around him began to stir. Something was moving behind him. At first, Vetrov thought they were shadows. But then I saw that they were too slow, too meaningful. Tall, thin silhouettes resembling elongated human figures walked through the void. They had no faces, but Vetrov felt that they were watching. Who is this? His voice was strangled, almost broken. Gromov did not answer. He slowly stepped back into the darkness, towards them. Gromov. Vetrov took a step forward, but immediately failed. He was flying. And suddenly, the light. USSR, December 1971. The Polar Urals. Vetrov woke up screaming. His face was covered in snow. The ice burned his skin, the frosty air burned his lungs. He is alive. He jerked over and looked around. The white desert stretched around, without traces, without signs of people. But the helicopter was gone. Everything was gone. He was alone. Vetrov was breathing sharply, and his heart was thudding in his chest. Oh my God. He slowly got to his feet. The time? What time is it now? Where is he? When is he? And then, Vetrov heard a voice. Behind. Soft, smooth. Lieutenant Vetrov. He whirled around. A man in a black tunic, with smoothly combed hair, was standing a few steps away from him. It took Vetrov a second to figure out who it was. Colonel Antonov. But he looked older? Much older. Vetrov opened his mouth, but Antonov raised his hand, stopping him. Don't say anything. I know what you want to ask. Vetrov felt an icy terror growing inside him. Antonov sighed heavily and said, It's 1989. The world swam around him. The winds collapsed in the snow. USSR, February 1989. The Polar Urals. Vetrov couldn't breathe. The snow beneath him felt alien, the air around him was too heavy. He looked at Antonov, but could not accept what was said. The year is 1989. This can't be happening. But the man in front of him. It was the same Colonel Antonov, but older. Deep wrinkles, gray temples, but the same cold piercing gaze. This is impossible. Breathed out the winds, feeling the world swaying around him. Antonov nodded slowly. That's what I thought when we found you. Vetrov jerked his head up. Found it. Antonov sighed heavily. You disappeared in 1971, 17 years ago. My heart thudded in my chest once, twice. No. Vetrov dug his fingers into the snow, trying to feel reality. This is a mistake. This is a prank. But Antonov wasn't laughing. How much do you remember, the last moment before you woke up here? Gromov's face flashed before Vetrov's eyes. His glass eyes. The shadows are behind him. And the words, you shouldn't have come here. He swallowed, his breath coming in short gasps. Gromov? Antonov nodded slowly. Did you find him? Yes. Antonov did not answer immediately. And then he said, Wins. Alexei Gromov never returned. Vetrov froze. But I saw him. I talked to him. Antonov pursed his lips. Are you sure? Vetrov opened his mouth to reply, but immediately froze. Flashes of memory stabbed painfully into consciousness. They're here, they're watching. They're already inside. That. His voice broke. Wasn't it him? Antonov slowly shook his head. We still haven't found Gromov's body. Just his plane. Broken, with no signs of life. The world around them shrank, as if the air had become heavier. But then, who was talking to me? Antonov did not answer. He was just watching. Vetrov suddenly realized how Antonov was looking at him. Not as a friend. Not as an officer, but as something else. "You're back, Vetrov," the colonel said slowly. "Yes." His voice was trembling. "I'm back. But are you the same person who left in 1971? Silence. The snow no longer felt cold. Vetrov suddenly realized that he did not feel the frost. He abruptly stretched out his hand to his face. And he froze. His fingertips were trembling. The skin was too smooth. Too white. In the distance. Deep in the snowy wasteland. A voice was heard. "You didn't come back." And then the light went out.